But today we're here to discuss, what is root cause analysis? So what this topic is all about is when you or your team run into difficult problems, it's not about how you go about solving them. It's about how you go about analyzing what is the real cause of the problem so you know what to solve. And then just as importantly, taking steps to make sure that you don't repeat those problems. So we're going to go into this in detail. This one is a little lengthy. We'll go about an hour. Oops, I have to be on the right screen. So this is how we normally handle incidents and problems. Our focus is to make the pain stop as quickly as we can. And in a work environment, you'll find that something that really influences that desire for a quick fix is you're going to have users and managers and other people in and outside of your organization, really pounding you. They're really going to be on the phone and in text messages and whatnot, emails. When's it going to be fixed? When's it going to be fixed? So our first impulse is just to put a Band-Aid on the problem. And while that does fix the pain as quickly as possible, it has some really negative side effects. It tends to cause technical debt, and it doesn't ensure that the same problem won't crop up again. And again, technical debt is one of the biggest challenges that we face in software development. Regardless of what role. It doesn't matter that you're a product owner or a UI UX developer or a Python developer. Technical debt is something that accumulates over time, and it's always more costly to fix it, the longer that it goes on. Yeah, I'll tell you, in projects that I've headed up in the past, I always made it an objective of every Scrum sprint to fix technical debt. I tried to allocate, in most cases, around 10% of the available time to fixing existing technical debt. So let's define what is root cause analysis, or RCA. Well, it's all about not just treating the symptoms of the illness. It's about how do you cure the disease. So what RCA does is it's a structured process that helps to identify the fundamental things that lead up to a problem or an incident. And that word, or that fundamental factor, that particular term, that's really significant, because in many cases, what our tendency is to fix the symptom rather than the thing that caused the symptom. And our second thing we want to do is we want to implement a long-term solution that prevents reoccurrence and also prevents technical debt. If you don't fix the root cause, chances are that's technical debt. That problem's going to come back at some point. And again, it's kind of obvious. This matters because we're trying to address, what is that underlying reason for the problem. We want to stop wasting time. We don't want to have to fix the same problem over and over and over again. And then this is a core practice. It is a core component of Agile. And at Chingu and in many other organizations, you'll find that Agile Scrum is the particular Agile method or framework that's used. So it's built into just about any Agile framework, like Scrum or test-driven development or whatever. All right, before I go on, are there any questions so far? What we're going to go through next are some examples. What does an RCA report look like? Well, this is one that I created. I created a problem on the 27th of September And what that problem was, I was testing in production. This is where Andres and Dinesh are going to yell at me. Uh, but I was testing something in production and thought I was doing it in a way that uh, that it would stop before it executed the complete workflow. And what happened was it did not stop. It actually went ahead and it emailed 930 incorrect Voyage 58 announcements before I caught it and stopped it. Um, so luckily, this wasn't very critical. It wasn't aggravation to the people that received the email because there were parts of the email that had data values where we should have substituted real data, things like what's the start date of the voyage, what's the voyage name, and that substitution didn't occur. So what they saw in their email was just a placeholder that said something like, start date goes here, that type of thing. So it was confusing, but again, it was a low impact. Now, the root cause of this, number one, the root cause was I was testing in production, and that's a bad thing. Um, the other thing that was a root cause or that factored into it is that the workflow itself didn't contain any precautions to make sure that email node in the workflow would be executed when we were doing testing. And just to give you a view of what N8N looks like, let me log on and I'll show you just briefly. This isn't going to be a presentation about N8N, but I want to show you what the workflow looks like. So this is a graphical workflow, and it has each of these steps is called a node. So I was testing, I was testing in this email voyage announcement node. And again, the problem was I didn't think that when I was doing the test that it would send out the emails, and in fact it did. So I just went into N8N and the workflow just to give you some context and background on what this looks like. So the resolution for this was that we need to update all of our automation workflows to include a configuration node that lets us basically declare, is this for test or is this for production? The other thing that needed to take place is that particular workflow didn't have enough comments in it. Now, granted, adding a comment doesn't prevent a problem. It reduces the probability, but it still depends on someone reading the comment. So what we're doing right now, there's a little more detail behind this. In all of our automation workflows, we are adding a node that basically declares, is this for test or production? And then we're also adding some checks that if it's test, that we ensure that certain nodes aren't executed. Because again, we don't want to repeat this session or this problem. Now, this is an example of a very simple RCA report. It's something I shared with the other admins, and I'm obviously sharing it with you. There are a couple key things here. Number one, this is fairly simple, and we'll talk about this later in this presentation, but you don't want to create an RCA process that's overly complex. And the reason is you don't want the person who's involved in troubleshooting the problem to basically avoid creating the RCA report because it takes so much time. Now, some RCA reports will take more time than others because of the nature of the issue. So you want that you want to put your time or devote time to it based upon the nature of the issue, the complexity of the issue, not the RCA process itself. And I can tell you, when I worked at IBM, we had an RCA process that this report was, God, it was like 8 pages, I think, or 7 or 8 pages of questions. It was just overly complex. And the negative of that is in the team I worked on, everyone's objective was not to cause a problem because you didn't want to have to fill out the RCA report. Doing an RCA, that process at that company was so, well, actually, it was that particular team was so complex that it literally took like half a day to do a simple RCA. So again, this is just an example, but I want to see if there's any questions. Cool. We'll go on then. If there are questions, again, feel free to add them in the Google Meet chat, or you can ask in the voice channel. Or if you have suggestions or comments as well. So let's now go over at a high level, what's the RCA process? You know, it's not just a form. There are steps we have to go through to really do a good RCA analysis or issue analysis. So number one, we want to define the problem. You know, we want to understand and gather information about, what actually occurred. And we want to do it in a way that's simple to understand. Now, there's a quote that was attributed to, I believe, Albert Einstein, where he said that you don't truly understand a topic or a subject unless you can explain it to your grandmother. Well, that's basically the advice you should follow in the RCA and in a lot of other things in software development as well. But you want to define the problem so that it doesn't matter if your immediate supervisor is reading it or one of your teammates or the CEO of your company. They should all be able to understand very clearly what was the problem. Once you've collected the evidence, then you want to look at what are the causal factors. So again, the causal factor isn't the symptom, it's the thing that caused the symptom. And that may sound very abstract, but it's actually a really key point because again, in many cases, it's not the symptom that's the problem. There was something else that caused the symptom. And that's what we want to go after. That's what we're looking for. Now, once we've identified the factors, what are the real causes of the problem? Now we can start developing and implementing solutions. And then finally, we need to monitor the solution. We need to make sure that the solution we've implemented is really working. So that requires monitoring to ensure that we don't prevent it from reoccurring. And next, we're going to go through these in detail. It's not a lot of detail, but there are some additional steps behind each one of these 5 points. But any questions or comments so far? You are going easy on me. Yeah, and these links, I will post the PDF version of this deck with live links in the Town Hall chat channel at the end of this. But here's a sample RCA report. And again, each company, there is no one standard. Each company has their own. So you can see that this one is a little more involved than the one that I showed earlier. But it's not so involved that it should take a lot of time to fill out the form or follow the process. Again, what'll take the time is analyzing the problem, collecting evidence, and identifying the real causes. All right, so to define the problem, again, you want to state what is the problem very clearly, and you want to pull in the facts. You want to focus on what happened, where it happened, and when did it happen. Now, in some cases, I've seen that people focus on the symptom again, and they forget about, well, where did it happen and when did it happen? And what was the impact of the problem? The RCA, when you define the problem isn't that, I received an incorrect email. I mean, that's part of it. The real problem is I received an incorrect email. It didn't have the right customization performed on it. So it was something I couldn't understand or act upon. And it caused confusion. Now I'm left with, well, when does this voyage start? And what is the voyage name and whatnot? Another really critical factor is avoid blame. The RCA process is not about saying Andres is wrong or Dinesh is wrong, and slapping on them on the hand for doing something. So we're not here to blame someone. Now, we do need to identify who are the people, who are the people that involved in the creation of the problem, but we don't want to blame them. We don't want to ridicule them because we're going to need to include them in this process because they are the ones that will be critical in helping to identify a solution. So we want to enlist their help.
Jim,
Yes, sir.
however, I see blame more like a simile with it blame. You're not you're not pointing fingers to someone, but you are identifying the person who wrote something that caused a trouble. Probably it was within the requirements, it was within all the expectations, but something was not considered elsewhere. So I think it's more like a git blame rather than pointing fingers. Oh, you did something wrong.
Well, I agree with that. That's exactly true. The reason I brought up blame here is the kind of blame we want to avoid is a punishment type of thing. Now management can look at RCAs as part of, like annual employee reviews, something like that. And they should look at that. They should look at it and say, oh, well, look, Jim created, one problem a week that required it was serious enough it required an RCA, but that shouldn't be part of the problem resolution process or the RCA process. But absolutely, we have to identify who caused the problem because again, they're going to be instrumental in gathering data and identifying how to fix it. At least that's the theory. So the blame is more of an identification, not a punishment step. Does that make sense?
At least for me, it does.
Cool. If you're happy, I'm happy. All right, so the next step is collecting data. Before we can understand or begin to identify what is the real cause of a problem, we need to get logs and user feedback and timelines. Metrics are important, especially for things like performance problems. We also want to find out things like deployments. One of the things that I think is really important in any problem is the first thing I identify is when was the last change made to the software or the system. Because again, one of the if you understand that, oh yeah, this problem was introduced right after we released uh, a new version of the software. Now one of the things we could look at is what changed in that release related to this part of the code, and that'll help us or might help us identify the source of the problem. So you're collecting this data because if you're familiar with there was a US TV show called Crime Scene Investigation or CSI. There was like a CSI Miami, a CSI Las Vegas. It was a whole series of shows. They were scientific and criminal investigators that use science to solve crimes. Well, this is very much like that. We're looking at the data to help us identify, again, or get ready to identify what's the what's the actual real problem, the root cause. And once we've got that data, now we can start looking at, what are the factors that really cause the problem? Where did the symptom come? What's the origin point of the system or the symptom, I should say? And there's some techniques you can use to help identify that. And I'm actually going to skip to the next slide to go over these. Um, but the key point here, or a key point here, is that you're trying to go find the root cause or the root causes, that if you correct those, the problem goes away and doesn't happen again. That's really our goal. So there are other techniques besides these. These are three very popular ones, like 5 whys. This was actually developed, I believe, on the Toyota auto assembly line in Japan back in I think it came from the 60s and 70s, maybe even earlier. But they found that if you repeatedly ask why, so you ask, let's say that you have a case where there's maintenance on a fuel sensor in a car. There's repeated failures on it. Customers are bringing their autos into the repair shop because these sensors are failing. So the first question asked is, why is the sensor failing? Well, you look at the data and you see, oh, well, the sensor is it's showing that the fuel tank is empty when it actually has a quarter of the fuel of its capacity remaining. So your next question is, well, why is it showing that incorrect value on the gauge? And then you drill down and you go, oh, well, it's showing that because the placement of the sensor is not at the right position in the fuel tank. So then you drill down, well, why is the sensor in the wrong position on the fuel tank? Well, it's because the robot is inserting it at the wrong place. So your next question is, why is the robot inserting it at the wrong place? It's because the assembly robot is using an incorrect specification. So what you're doing is you're asking those 5 whys to drill down to the root cause. Now, this works for really simple problems. It gets you to a quick retrospective. It's not necessarily good for more complex problems, especially problems where there are interconnected systems that are required to build something or to run software, whatever. That's where the fishbone comes in. So I'm actually going to go back. So I'll pull it up here. Show you what a fishbone looks like. Yeah, so a fishbone diagram, it relates the interaction of different, people, machines, different things, different systems related to the thing that's having the problem. And if I go back to our presentation, again, what you're doing is you're showing the interrelationship, or you're following the interrelationship of these connected systems to identify what are the factors that contribute to the problem. And then finally, there's Pareto, which is that 80-20 rule. I actually personally don't think this should fall into the problem identification part or area. I think this is a rule to follow to determine where should I be spending my time. Because the example, what you're doing is you're using Pareto to find the top 20% of causes that are accounting for the most failures. So that's more of an identification metric in my mind. But when you read about RCA, you'll often see Pareto listed as a problem solving technique. So any questions? And again, there are others. These aren't the only three. Okay. So now, once you've identified what the causal factors, again, the root causes are, and be very careful. Many times there's not just one root cause, especially in the complex software that we tend to develop. You've got APIs feeding data to a front end, and you've got databases. There may actually be multiple root causes to a single problem. So now that you know you've identified what is the problem, now you can start coming up with, okay, how do we fix that root cause or root causes? Um, you should make sure that you're following SMART when you're coming up with these solutions. The solutions need to be specific. You need to identify how to measure them. They also have to be achievable. There may be some problems where you can't fix the entire problem all at once. Um, it very possibly may be that you have to do some type of temporary fix because fixing the real root cause might take several sprints. It may take even a new release of the software for all you know. So the key thing in that situation is you want to make sure that doesn't turn into technical debt. If the fixing the root cause is going to take a longer period of time, you need to make sure that you prioritize it so it gets the attention it deserves. And yeah, well, that's enough on that. Questions? Okay. So now we're finally, oh yeah, go ahead, Adewale.
Audio. Am I audible?
Yes, I can hear you just fine.
Okay, thank you, Jim. My question is this. You make emphasis on making sure that the root cause analysis does not go or affect the work. So I'm looking at it from a Scrum Master perspective. While running a project, to what extent, what time, the maximum amount of time should be allocated to working on a root cause analysis if we face a bottleneck, for instance. I think that needs to be quantifiable because, like you said, it could eventually result to a different release entirely, or it takes a long time fixing it and the team get demotivated and it just needs to be organized. So if you're looking at it from a live situation, how long should one actually focus on the RCA, not to get in the way of the developers and eventually affecting the increments?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think there's really two ways to answer that. The first way is I wouldn't attach an amount of time, pardon me, to how long should or how much time should we devote in the project to RCA? Because when RCAs occur, you have to address them, or when problems occur, you have to address them. Now, what I've done in the past with varying success, I've tried to allocate at the beginning of the project a certain amount of time. I say allocate. I've reserved a certain amount of time both for technical debt, addressing technical debt, but also addressing problems. So rather than estimating the time for the project as being solely how much time does it take to code and implement and test the new software or the changes, I basically look at how much time is available and I reserve a percentage of that for technical debt and RCA. Now it's a little easier for technical debt because you can do something like saying, well, I'll just reserve 5% of the time. So in each sprint, we're going to devote 5% or 10% to addressing existing technical debt that we identify. For RCAs, that's a little more difficult because different problems uh, require different amounts of time for the RCA. So I still reserve some amount of time, but I try to base it upon what's the history of my company and the particular application we're working in. Now, if it's a new application, you have no history. But if it's an existing application, you can look at, okay, what are my prior RCAs or my prior problem tickets? How much time did it take on an average to solve those? And look at using that as a baseline. Now, ultimately, though, it could be that problems could occur that um, that require you to adjust your product backlog. So, for example, a particularly complex problem may occur. To resolve it, you might have to add that to your product backlog. You should probably add the RCA to the backlog anyway, each RCA, so you account for the time. But it could be that you have one or more problems you've encountered that are so difficult, it reduces the amount of time available for development. So you might have to adjust it and change some features from must-haves to should-haves. Basically deprioritize them in order to meet your deadline. And this is jokingly, I'll say this is a dance, but this is a negotiation and a communication, and you have to conduct with both your management and your end users, all of your stakeholders, when these things come up to basically bring them up to date on here's the impact of this. Let's say that you hit a problem that's going to take an entire sprint, everyone's effort for an entire sprint to resolve. That means that your project now has one less sprint than it did before. So now you have to work with your stakeholders to, we either reduce features, so we reduce the total number of sprints required, or we extend the deadline by one sprint and the cost as well. Because if you add a sprint to the project, now your cost estimates for the project are going to run over. So did that help, Adewale?
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Oh, no worries. Sorry for the long-winded answer. That's a really good question because it's very complex. So Michael asked, other than fixing technical debt, are there any other contexts you'd commit to writing RCAs? So I wouldn't necessarily write an RCA for technical debt because technical debt doesn't necessarily cause a problem. Technical debt, for example, it might be something where it makes the code a little less maintainable. So it's not directly impacting the end users, it's an indirect impact. So an RCA may not be required. It may just be that's a user story that we need to add to our backlog. RCAs, because they're unpredictable, it's difficult to I think it's difficult for me anyway to answer that question about what are the contexts. It's when the problem occurs, if it's a major problem, you need to write an RCA. I guess that's actually the best answer. It depends on the complexity and the impact that the problem had. And that's something that's going to be unique to each organization. Some organizations might say, well, if it impacted the user's ability to complete their job or their assigned task, within a certain amount of time, we categorize that as being a major impact. Or it could be something about if it causes system downtime or application downtime of any kind, that's a major impact. So you kind of have to think about, what are the triggers and the thresholds that your organization has in order to determine when do you take the time to write an RCA. Did that help?
I will add something. Depending on the complexity of what you have for an RCA, I will value more that in most bugs that you find on your application should have an RCA. So you can reproduce, you can test upon it and see that it doesn't reproduce again. So in my point of view, if you have a simple enough RCA system like the one you showed us earlier, I think it's feasible to, with any bug, just write an RCA and that's it. But if you have a very complex RCA, maybe it's not worth the effort. I think that's a better way to see it.
Yeah, that's a good point. I agree with that. I'm glad you said that. Uh, the other thing is you need to think about in the development process when a bug uh, is uncovered in the new code you're writing and for the new features or enhancements. You have to look at when is an RCA required there. Now, I would say that I agree with Andres. I think that regardless of the severity of the bug when you're in new development, you should go through the RCA process yourself, for the code, the issues you uncover as you're writing the code. I think that's a good practice. You may not need to write an RCA for that if it's something that just affects you as a developer and not the rest of the team. Um, but an RCA may be required. You may want to do it if it's something serious, and it does affect other members of the team. Again, for new features and enhancements you're working on. But yeah, that's really important to have an RCA process that's complete enough that it captures the information, but isn't overly complex. You want to keep the focus on resolving the issue rather than following a process just because the process says this. Any other comments or questions? Yeah, go ahead, Adewale.
Yeah, I was just thinking, as you said, the RCA, in terms of whatever framework an organization is using, who is going to be accountable for an RCA? For instance, the Scrum Master wants to help a product owner. Is it the Scrum Master that is meant to write or design an RCA? Is the head of the development team meant to work on it while working on a sprint backlog or something? I'm just looking at who should be responsible and disseminating the information to the team to make sure that it's resolved.
Yeah, I'll hold on to that question because in a few slides, we're going to go through the Scrum events and show how they apply to RCA and who's involved. But in general, this is in general, I think the Scrum Master is the person that's responsible for identifying when is something serious occurring, and communicating that to the product owner. And obviously, the team members, they're probably the first ones that'll get the indication that there's an issue. They should be communicating with their scrum master. So, and in the real world, now that's true for applications, again, application enhancements and new features. Uh, in the real world, when you have a running application that you're maintaining, you're probably going to have some type of help desk. So when your users are reporting problems to the help desk, you're going to get that indication from your help desk staff. And that could be to anyone on the team. So for example, a help desk technician, because they know that Michael is working on the accounts receivable system, is the primary developer, they may reach out to him directly. So it's Michael's responsibility to basically communicate that to other members of the team. Um, in some organizations, smaller organizations, there may not be a help desk. As a developer, you may be the help desk and the developer. So I hope that helped. And again, as you can see, a lot of these answers, you have to look at the process, what's behind this, the flow, and tailor it to your organization. So the last step, now that we've identified and implemented the fix, we need to make sure that that fix really works and it continues to work. So the last step in the process is about verification. Verifying, yeah, the problem doesn't return. As part of this, you want to document your findings and essentially the RCA report. You want to keep a record of it so that when new problems occur, you can refer to old RCAs to see, hey, is this a reoccurrence of an old problem? Or maybe it's just related to an old problem, and that older RCA can help us speed the resolution process for the new issue. Now, I added this to this last bullet to the process. I think it's a really good idea that for major problems that occur, create an automated test that detects does the problem happen again? So that when you're doing new releases, you can run these automated, I should say, it's not really necessarily don't wait till deployment, but as you're developing new features and enhancements, you can run these tests to see if older problems have reoccurred. And I can tell you, I've done that at different organizations. For the really major things, whenever we could, we created an automated test and we made it part of our deployment process. And if these tests did not pass, we did not release the software. Now, what are the advantages of RCA to development teams? And this includes, all of the stakeholders. So number one, you're coming up with a sustainable solution. By addressing this fundamental flaw and correcting it, in the long run, you save time and money because you're not spending time, fixing the same problem over and over again. I'll give you an example from my past. This one is a really, I think, a really serious problem on multiple levels. I worked at an organization and I was working in like server administration at the time, but there was an accounts payable system that failed every 2 to 3 days. So every 2 to 3 days in the middle of the night, this batch kind of routine process would fail. And the operations staff would have to call the programmer or the developer responsible for accounts payable to fix the problem. And this went on for years. Well, if that was like I first noticed it at around 98, I think, 1998. So if we advance to 2012-ish, 13, um, I I had to take over responsibility for that system. And so I was the one getting woken up at 3 a.m. every 2 to 3 days to fix this problem. And what I noticed was the original developer who worked on this system for like literally like 30 years, she she never fixed the root cause. The root cause was basically lack of data validation. And so she had left the company, but because I knew her, I called her to try to get some background. And what she told me was she intentionally didn't fix it because she felt like it would make it easier for the company to lay her off. So she did it to try to secure her job, make her job more secure. So I didn't confront her on that, but what I did is the equivalent of the RCA that I did. I identified there were two root causes. Number one, there was improper data validation for this batch process. It was accepting applications from customers, um, wasn't validating the data properly, and so when this batch process ran, it would fail from data exceptions. The second cause was that basically what she had told me. It wasn't fixed because someone was trying to make sure their job was secure. So the solution to the problem wasn't very complex. I wrote a fork in the code, not a Git fork or a GitHub fork, but basically a logic fork that when invalid data was encountered, it routed that transaction to a holding file. It just skipped it and it went and processed the next transaction. So the nightly process never failed because of data validation. And then the next day, um, I had enhanced the application that allowed the accounts payable clerks to review the rejected transactions and to reach out to the vendors to fix their problem, basically allow them to fix the problem and resubmit the transaction. For financial reasons, there's some and legal reasons that we did not have the capability or the desire to fix the data provided by the vendor. So anyway, that fixed the problem, and that was a permanent fix. And I always felt like it was a pretty good fix because it didn't stop the batch process, and it allowed the accounts payable clerks to work with the vendors so they wouldn't repeat the process. Once they knew what caused a problem, then it was on them to not repeat it. And that was a really serious problem in my book. And that had more than one solution. There was a technical solution, but there was also a people issue with that. So the other advantage for a development team is over time, as you're doing RCAs, the quality of your application gets to be better. Because you fix problems once rather than over and over and over again, uh, you tend to have fewer defects. Pardon me. It also feeds into or supports your continuous improvement cycle in any application, which if you don't have, you should. You should have a culture of continuous improvement. Because RCA is data driven, and it's evidence based. Um, it basically removes the guesswork from problem resolution. The other thing is it provides a really good example for how to use data just in general, how to make database solutions or database solutions and strategies. Your team morale improves because there's no blame. Now again, not get blame, but there's no recrimination for errors. The focus is on fixing the error and improving the application. Team morale is improved and the team tends to work better. And then finally, you can learn a lot from RCAs. A lot of times an RCA will uncover not just here's how we fix this problem, but it may uncover technical debt or even not technical debt, but improvements that need to be made to the application itself. So that's basically why some of the reasons why you should do this. But there are some disadvantages. Okay. Um, as Adewale, noticed, RCAs aren't free. They do take time. Even if it's only 15 minutes, that's still 15 minutes that you're not coding. So, you're not doing something else. So I would suggest that RCAs have a higher priority and have a lot of value. But by the same time, if you're facing deadlines, they are going to take time away from you being able to meet that deadline. So you do have to do some planning and you do have to prioritize and you have to convince your stakeholders that RCAs are worth the time. We talked about, time boxing and you know, getting away from a blame-based culture. So I won't go over that again. Um, RCAs for more complex problems can be time consuming and involved because it may take a cross-functional team. Here we've listed, developers, POs, Scrum Masters, and UI UX professionals, but it's not uncommon for complex problems that you also have representatives from your end user community. You might have people from your operations staff, your server administration, database administrators. It may take more than just one developer uh, to do the RCA correctly and to identify and fix the problem. Um, Again, one of the disadvantages, again, is focusing on just the symptoms. We discussed that enough, I think, but you never want to lose sight of the fact that you're trying to find an actionable root cause, not just the symptom. And then finally, there could be resistance to change, uh, primarily within the development team itself, and actually managers. There is a collaboration part of this where you have to make sure that all your stakeholders understand the value and commit to the process. And as we've said over and over, Andres has said it and Dinesh has said it, we need to keep it simple and actionable. We don't want the process to slow everything down. The process should support fixing the problem, the root cause, rather than preventing people from following the RCA. Now, Adewale, here's where we get to your question in a little more detail. How do you apply this to Scrum teams? Okay. So one of the first ways is in the sprint retrospective. For minor problems, they are always good topics for your end of sprint retrospective. For more serious RCAs, you may want to convene or start a dedicated retrospective, that basically is part of your RCA process. And the people who are most involved in this are basically your Scrum Masters, the facilitator of the retrospective, but you'll also want to have, obviously, your developers and your product owner there as well. Now, if you're following strict Scrum, there are some practitioners of Scrum who say the PO should not be part of the retrospective. But in this case, remember that since the PO is the individual that's talking to stakeholders outside of your development team, you want to make sure that they're involved in this and they have the information they need to communicate to other stakeholders. Yeah, Andre said he's found that resistance to change is proportional to the severity of the issue. That is true. And you'll always get pushback from management to, make the pain go away. I shouldn't pick on management because I was a manager, but that is true. All right, so for the product backlog, this gets back to your question, Adewale, or some of your points. You need to make sure that you refine your product backlog items, with the RCAs. You need to account for the time for the major RCAs. But by adding it to your backlog, you're also elevating the visibility and the priority of the RCA as well. And again, this is your PO is the owner, if you will, of the product backlog, but your developers and your UI UX designers and your Scrum Masters are contributing to the backlog. We're going to go down a little rabbit hole. I am a big believer in allowing developers, UI UX designers, and Scrum Masters to add questions and details to product backlog items. I like doing that because that makes each product backlog item, like a diary entry. It records the history around a particular item in your backlog. And it's a good asynchronous way to keep your product owner up to date. Your daily Scrum, obviously, issues are going to be blockers. So you need to talk about them in your daily Scrum. And one of the things you're looking for is when you have any blocker is, number one, you're reporting it so it has visibility. But number two, in the daily Scrum, that's a place where you can identify who's can best help you with this issue. And again, that's developers and the Scrum Master. And then finally, you've got incident and defect management. After a high priority bug is fixed, you want to have a dedicated RCA session, which might look a lot like a retrospective. And there's nothing wrong in saying we want to convene a special sprint retrospective just for this bug to handle it. That's up to you and your team. And again, that is a pretty wide range of folks. That's your developers, your Scrum Master. If you've got QA staff and testers, that would include them as well. So hopefully this helped with that question of how do you apply this to Scrum and to Scrum teams. So finally, what are some of the takeaways from this? Number one, define your triggers. You need to establish the clear criteria for all your stakeholders that defines when do you need a formal RCA. Now, again, even with a trigger around a formal RCA, I think it's still a good practice that in development, that when you hit a bug in new code you're developing, follow some of these same steps, like clearly stating what is the issue and collecting evidence about it, and then basing any following actions on that evidence. You want it to be a blame-free zone. So, and by blame, again, just to be clear, we're not trying to, we want to identify who might have caused the problem, but we want to do it in a way that lets us enlist their help and to make them want to help resolve the issue. Now, again, for performance reviews, that's something management might look at RCAs to try to come up with an improvement plan for particular staff members, but that's not part of the actual development team's concern. And it's definitely not part of the RCA process. All we're focused on is how can we fix the problem and how can we learn from it? Again, another takeaway, lots of problems are going to require you to engage the development team and in some cases, stakeholders outside of the development team. So everyone's perspective is important, and the more complex and more severe the problem, probably the wider you'll see that cross development or cross functional team be. Speaking of that, I remember in a topic. It was an issue. It wasn't really a problem, but I worked at a very large company, and it had almost 200,000 employees worldwide. And I remember showing up for a committee meeting, and there were 70 people on the committee meeting, um, or committee members, including, like 5 vendors. It was kind of ridiculous, really. Nothing could get done because the committee was too large. Their scope was too large. And then finally, you want to prioritize an experiment. Uh, it may not be advisable to, if there's more than one root cause to a problem, you might want to fix them in a certain order so that you can fix one root cause, test the results, and then go on to the next root cause or cause to a particular problem. Um, and that's because sometimes um, there's both risk in fixing the problem, but there's also you may not be 100% sure about the root cause. If let's say there's 3 root causes you've identified, you want to prioritize it. Oh, this is the one we're going to fix first is the one that we know is having an impact. But we might be only 90% sure about the other 2. So let's fix the first one. We'll collect more data to determine are the next 2 really the root causes. So this is where, for complex problems, sometimes you have to take a staged approach to resolving them. And that's it. We've gone about an hour, a little over. I want to see if there's any questions or comments or concerns or criticisms, for that matter, of anything we've discussed today. You guys have gone way too easy on me. So let's open it up. Are there questions on anything at all? Anything about Chingu or anything else that you'd like to discuss before we close this out? I will show you something, a change we just made this morning. So we are in the process of transitioning our Voyage sign up. We've updated the form today. We're moving from adding people to Voyage teams based upon their time zone to adding them based upon time blocks. So what I'm displaying is a section in the handbook. For Voyage 58, we are still going to assign people to teams based upon time zone. But in Voyage 59, you will identify a primary and an alternate, what we call a time block, and it's based upon your time zone. So I'm in UTC -6. I would specify that I'm available at dawn, which is UTC 22 to 0400, which would be 4 p.m. to 10 p.m. for me. So when we form teams, we're going to form them around teams who have specified this as their time block. And that way, that does a couple things. It helps to ensure that everyone on the team will be available at the same in the same time range. The other thing that it does, which is just as important, it means that teams will be more cross-cultural. It could be that Dinesh is working at this time, and so Dinesh is in India. He and I would be on the same team. Where today, because we're doing it strictly by individual time zone, we would not. Dinesh would only be on a team with other people in his time zone, which I think is UTC plus five, actually 5:30. So it helps broaden our perspective because uh, we're going to be working with uh, people from other countries and cultures. Oh yeah, thanks for answering that, Andres. I appreciate that. It will be tomorrow sometime. We'll have this posted. We'll have this roundtable posted. So again, I'm going to do a last call for questions before we close out. We welcome questions of any type. Never think that your question or issue you may have is too simple. Never think that your question is um, a stupid question. We don't. We welcome them all. Oh yeah, thank you, Andres. I won't forget to publish this. All right. Well, I want to thank everyone for your time today and your attention, and most of all, we had some really good questions, which makes these roundtables more valuable than just a deck. So, thank you all. I'm looking forward to seeing you in our Discord channels and in Voyage, hopefully 58 and beyond. So, we'll also later this week have a major announcement about roundtables as well coming hopefully midweek. So we'll post that in the Pound Announcements channel. So with that, everyone have a great rest of your weekend, and we'll talk to you later. Bye bye.
Thanks, Jim. Bye, everybody.
See ya. Pardon me.